already suspicious to me. Two, if you read further down, they talk about all the things they want to build, how great it's going to be for the city, but then they go on to say they have to have a 6-acre contiguous open space due to large setbacks in a shallow groundwater table, which is going to require them to build parking above ground. Then they go on to say that in order for this development to be feasible, they need building heights of 85 to 90 feet. So by my estimate, this is up to 9-story buildings. We're no longer talking about dense development. We're talking about literal towers in Woodinville that stand to displace the small businesses that many of us know and love. They go on even further to say that this is a great plan. This is used elsewhere in the region. Well, we're not elsewhere in the region. We're Woodinville. They say if only lower heights are permitted, such as 60 feet, and I think our limit, at least in CBD, is 57 feet, quote, this unfortunately is an infeasible building to construct. Then the very last part, which is the real kicker, they say these changes will not happen overnight. We're happy to report that McClendon's recently extended their lease another 5 years. But the changes are setting the stage for the next 10 to 15 years. I read that as an implicit admission that they plan to displace McClendon's and other businesses in the next 10 years. If you do nothing else today, I urge you to vote against this particular part of the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Allison Farmer.
Hi, I'm Alison Farmer, Woodinville resident for 23 years, but live outside the city limits. I'm here today about the GB area. So the East Side Rail Corridor, you're calling it EMU, I would say it's probably not the most attractive bird I've ever seen, but it's a very appropriate name, because by choosing to add residential to the GB, the city is basically burying their heads in the sand. It only temporarily avoids the real problem you have, which is building more affordable housing, which we need. Don't be fooled by the numbers presented to you here today on the GB zone figures. They all show the affordable units going in there, yet not one person is saying that will happen, including the developer. The city's proposing submitting a fictitious document that will forever lose a vital future asset to the city and overburden us with housing trying to make up the shortfall. It will lead to a monoculture of moderate income apartments, a sea of gridlocked people with nowhere to work or play. The GMA is about balance. With so much housing in the pipeline, now is not the time to rezone an area that the city will need for affordable business and entertainment. Please find another more realistic way of fulfilling this document requirement. If you really need the new zone, because of the no supporting document thing that seems to be a hurdle and making this in a hurry, why don't you just rezone all the remaining buildable residential units? That would satisfy the requirement. It would be a totally new zone. You can then take your time and work out where all the affordable and the different kinds of housing are going to go that the GMA requires, and work out with the owners through developer agreements on what actually gets built in the future. I'm not so much against the Innovation Centre becoming mixed if all the residential they build is actually affordable. Their letter indicates they are keen to fill this need, so that might be a way. But did you see the future building of the centre just died in that owner's desire to add residential? Mixed residential can kill businesses and creative ideas, especially affordable ones. The area highlighted by the city is one for economic improvement, as it was underutilised. The idea first came from the owner, however, who is pushing for this rezone. So he has likely not been signing long leases or encouraging new tenants with that goal in mind. When he says it is not economic to build the village without housing, I guess anyone got déjà vu on that? Well, we've had that one before. What he means is there's more profit in housing for him, and his land will be more valuable if upzoned. There will be thousands of residents downtown in future, more than enough to support anything that gets built. Hopefully the economies will look less murky then. So please don't sacrifice what's valuable and needed, an asset for future downtown Woodinville. This is the heart of the city. It needs food and laughter and unblocked arteries to survive, not just accommodation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Rachel Bess Campbell.
Good evening, Rachel Best Campbell. I live within city limits. You have in front of you the same paper that I have in front of me, so I won't bore you by reading it verbatim, but I wanted to bring to your attention that this is a 20-year plan that we're talking about. And rezoning the general business district does not mean we immediately need to open the floodgates and say, we're going to have 10,000 units coming in there. I would urge you to consider a more phased and measured approach. Think about rezoning parcels at a time, taking the time to see what is built, who is building it, what type of affordability we're talking about. More data makes better decisions. Something else I think that we really need to think about, and again, this is not part of your conversation tonight, but I believe it should be, we need to have a blanket affordability across the city. We don't need one section on the wrong side of the tracks with all of the affordability units. It makes more sense to integrate it so that we have a more integrated community. Again, these are steps that we can take initially in this 20-year plan that already exists in code. For example, East Frame, we have the allowance for 75 feet in a development agreement. We could exchange that and say, you're welcome to build to 75 feet by right if you provide a certain percentage of affordability above and beyond the blanket 25%. There are ways for us to make these numbers within the code that we already have by tweaking it a little bit. So I urge you to read through these phases and think about this, not as we have to have this done by the end of the year. It's a plan, and part of plans is you have steps and measurements along the way, and I encourage you to start thinking sort of like steering a ship. We're aiming for way over there in the future. Let's start thinking strategically and take our time on this. We only have one chance to rezone our city. Let's do it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Megan Lee.
Good evening. I'm Megan Lee. I'm a business owner just across the railroad tracks in the GB, and I'm not a resident of Woodinville, but I've been the business owner for 3 years now. I'm just speaking to try to help preserve the business areas for industrial and commercial businesses within the area, as I know that many of us have been around since before the city was even created, like businesses like the one that I own, and many Woodinville residents and businesses do rely on us to provide services to them. And so I just want to make it clear that a lot of people do rely on us, including the city itself. So pushing our businesses out to other areas may result in our businesses leaving the city overall. So thank you.
Thank you. That's everybody that has signed up. Is there anybody else in the audience that would like to please come forward, state your name, whether you live in the city or not? You have 3 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Alex Campbell. I live in the city. And I, off spur of the moment, wanted to just speak up on this. I was actually here last week and showed you all this neat little tool. It's still posted online. I went through and updated some of the details before I saw the staff packet. Good news is the staff packet actually moved more square footage into the section I'm calling East Frame, which is covered by the code that was passed by the city already, which effectively means we've increased the amount of potential units in downtown with some minor modifications. That means that we actually can, with a 25% across the board citywide requirement, 50% for floors 6 and 7. So basically you give a unit, you get a unit affordability in East Frame. That's only in East Frame. And then basically that gets you the numbers. The only thing would be that you have to use Woodgate level density, which is 105 units per acre, which is what the most recent construction in the downtown is, so we all know what it looks like. I think it's actually a really good, viable option, and if it does go to the growth planning board, we tell them, look, this is our first pass. We have 5-year renewal cycles to recheck this. We're open to GB later, but this is our first pass, and we're going to see how it starts to develop over 5 or 10 years. Even if you waited till 2034 to do the rezone, that's 10 more years. That's a full development agreement lifetime for developers to build the new denser units somewhere else. GB specifically. So I think this is a case where we want to take it very slow and very measured and use the math and the data. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. That will take us to our one and only business discussion item tonight, the Comprehensive Plan Periodic Review, GB Mixed-Use Proposal, Planning for Housing by Income Groups. Director Grumbach.
All right, good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. First of all, thank you for this follow-up kind of last-minute meeting. Originally, we were going to try to do some of this at the last meeting, but I think it actually works out better that we're breaking this up because then we can kind of focus a little bit more specifically on the topic at hand. So just give me a moment here for my presentation to come on up. All right, so this is essentially a study session that is a chance to talk, and I'm kind of hoping to get some feedback as to kind of the direction. We're going to talk a little bit about the meeting that the council had, I believe it was last week or 2 weeks ago, on the 16th, and some of the direction they gave, and then we're going to kind of walk through a whole bunch of items and stuff. Hopefully most of you had a chance to look at the staff report. There is a lot of technical stuff in there. And one of the reasons I present a lot of that technical stuff is I'm trying to give the background so people understand how we actually get to where we get to in needing to come up with some way of meeting these GMA requirements for housing at all the different income levels. So the purpose of the meeting is going to be discuss the City Council's guidance on converting parts of the general business zone into a new mixed-use zone by adding residential development. So the focus on tonight is primarily determining potential boundaries for the new East Rail mixed use. That's what we're calling this GB mixed use area. The name can change if there's a desire to make it some other name, but for now we've been using the name East Rail because GB mixed use kind of seemed to get a little stale and doesn't necessarily reflect everything that's kind of going on. So that's kind of what our main focus. And then I broke this presentation down into 3 parts. So the first part is going to talk about some of the background that went into this proposal. Then we're going to talk about some of the GMA requirements. And what I'm going to do is walk you through a bit more of Commerce's guidance as to what we need to do in order to be able to show that we are meeting our requirements for planning for housing at all different income levels. And then what we'll do is we will talk about EMU, or the East Rail mixed-use alternatives. And on that one, I tried to break things down. I'll talk a little bit more about when we get there, but I tried to break that down into sections so we can kind of talk about these as we kind of try to fit and put things together and ultimately come up with what we want to use as kind of the baseline going forward. Doesn't mean, by the way, whatever we do tonight, doesn't mean that's necessarily where we end up at the end of the day. What it is just basically giving me some direction, staff some direction as to how we need to proceed on this, because we do have some work we need to get done in order to meet certain procedural requirements and stuff like that. And this proposal on whatever the boundaries for the EMU is going to be is actually a key part of our GMA requirements. So, and by the way, I'll also mention, I always mention this because this is a study session. At any point, if you want to ask questions, please feel free, just interrupt and ask the questions. There may be some time where maybe the question may be answered in a later slide, and I'll just let you know if that's the case. But anytime when questions start popping up, please feel free to be asking those, okay? So let's start out with a little bit of the background. So this idea, I think I've talked to you about this a little bit before, and I've mentioned this in multiple reports before, but the idea actually did not start with GMA. The original idea about creating a mixed-use zone out of GB area originated in our economic plan for, back in 2022. It was a 10-year economic plan that we put together. And what actually started this whole idea was the fact that we are putting a lot of money, or planning to put a lot of money into the East Rail corridor. And so typically, whenever a city is making large investments into infrastructure improvements and stuff, a lot of times you kind of want to see if there's ways to use those investments to help spur other things like economic development or whatever things. In this case, it was more specifically around the economic development. And so that was the question that kind of what the council was working through, was how to utilize this investment to promote economic development. And so this is one of the policies that was included in that economic development plan. It said update the GB zone and align the permitted use table with an increased focus on office, professional services, businesses, and housing. So that's where this all started out. Then, and I wanted to just talk real quick about this East Rail corridor. And if any of you saw the council meeting on the 16th, this is the same slide that I had presented here. So the East Rail Trail is a project that's actually, it's multi-jurisdictional. It is going to be a 42-mile trail. It's replacing rail lines starting down in Renton and moving all the way up and into Snohomish County, and potentially could end up going beyond. Woodinville has a nice little piece of it that's located here, and I think most of you have seen recently we've been able to get possession of the rail tracks over here, just I guess over in this direction by the city, and we've had those rail lines removed. And so the next step of this is we're working towards planning on replacing the trellis and also on putting money into making improvements for the trail. And let's see, is there anything else? Oh, and I just want to know, these are some of the things I mentioned about the rail tracks, the trestle replacement, which I think a lot of you are pretty familiar with, and also related to this, as part of the Woodgate project, the replacement over there, we are doing an extension of 133rd Avenue Northeast, which will extend all the way up to Little Bear Creek, and that also kind of ties into some of these improvements and stuff that we're working on as well. So, following the economic plan, we had this housing action plan that the state gave us a grant for to develop. And the idea behind this housing action plan was to take a look at our housing needs, and use this in support of updating our housing element of our comprehensive plan. And so it did include in there a housing needs assessment based on affordability. I think most of you were on the commission when we talked about that. So, but if there's any questions on that, happy to try to answer. Amanda was kind of our main staff person that worked on that. But it had a lot of really good information about where rents were, where affordability was. You know, we actually have a lot of folks in here that actually are rent or house price burdened. When you take a comparison of what their rent or what the price of their payments on their homes are in relationship to what their income levels would be. So this plan also included this a little bit more expanding on the idea about revising the general business zone to create this mixed use zone. And again, as mentioned too, we called it GB mixed use in the past, but we're referring to it now as East Rail mixed use. And it included, as part of some of the action pieces of this, one of the things that was talked about was maybe having a mandatory inclusionary zoning or maybe even voluntary incentives to promote affordability. And one of the things that kind of spurred the GB mixed use area is the fact is that we would have this brand new zone, nothing else really on top of it right now. So you could basically have a blank canvas, and you'd be able to basically create something out of that blank canvas. So that's kind of what started this whole idea in the first place. And one of the other things that was really important, and council's talked about this even in the last discussion, is that there needed to be consideration given to displacement of businesses in the CBD and GB zone. And although you don't typically think about displacement of businesses as part of a housing action plan, you know, we recognize that a lot of the properties that are primed for potential redevelopment are, because Woodinville has focused most of its future growth in its CBD and down in its commercial areas, most of those properties that are primed for redevelopment have commercial businesses on them. And so in bringing in more housing units to meet our GMA requirements, there's a recognition that you're going to end up replacing low-income rent with potentially higher. So one of the things council wanted to include in this, and we will have more probably discussions around this, is figuring out how we can maybe put things in there that can address this potential issue of displacement of current businesses. Or if they are displaced, what kind of mitigation measures and how could we potentially make sure that we do maintain a certain degree of affordable commercial spaces here in Woodinville. So that's not necessarily part of the GMA requirements, but that is one of the things that is part of the Housing Action Plan, and it is also one of the things that Council has definitely given direction. That is something that we're going to be taking a look at even more detail particularly when we start getting like into the development regulations and stuff. So any questions at this point?
Commissioner Turcotte.
Just to clarify, in the background, it does mention, in addition to affordable housing, the addition of group homes, foster care facilities, emergency housing, shelters, and permanent supportive housing. Is that part of this too, or is that something that we have to take into consideration when we're considering this, or we can only do the affordable housing bit at this point?
So, and we'll talk a little bit more details about it. So, yeah, the requirements by the GMA and by the state has to deal with those different income levels. And it's actually not just the houses that are like in the low or extremely low income brackets. It also does include moderate income housing and also high income housing as well. We have to plan for all of those. It's just in the case of Woodinville, we already have a lot of moderate and high income. So our bigger burden is on the lower end of the scale. Those other housing types, some of those actually get included into the low income, and then some of the other bits of those housing don't actually fall into those target numbers, although they do have numbers that we need to plan for, but those actually are going to be, those are very specifically more not part of the market, or more specifically part of like the emergency housing and stuff. That's actually other programs that you're not going to see markets or even necessarily government housing programs necessarily focus on. So I've got a table, and I've showed this before, and I'll show you the kind of the breakdown of where the numbers come from and how they're assigned. So we do have to plan for all of those things, and some of those things that we had to do, like the emergency housing and stuff, we actually already addressed a couple of years ago when we updated some of our regulations regarding hotels and stuff like that. So, yeah, so some of those things have been addressed, but I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment, too.
Commissioner Meza.
Thank you. Clarification question. Are there requirements that we create a certain amount of affordable housing stock, or that we have zoning that would allow for that? And if it's the former, are there any consequences if we don't meet those housing stock goals?
Yeah, I've actually got slides I'm going to talk about that. So let's go through these slides, because I'm going to be getting on topic with some of those things, including the consequences and stuff that can happen if we don't meet our GMA requirements. And it is important to note that, you know, we've got, and I think I may mention this in a later slide, our housing plan has to be reviewed by King County. They don't necessarily give an approval or anything, but they do review it, and they'll offer comments and stuff on that. And ultimately, we have to be able to pass muster if there is challenges to our housing element, and it goes to the Growth Hearings Board. What they do in their reviews is they'll determine whether we're in compliance or non-compliant, and a determination of non-compliance found by the hearings board doesn't mean, it has one of two things. It either can go back and us get the work done and then get it back, and it's not like we get to wait on it. It's like you got to get it back within a certain time frame, or if it's considered deliberate, then potentially you can see things being sent off to the governor, and there can be sanctions then raised against the city. And I'll talk a little bit more about those sanctions in a slide here a little bit later. I did bring these up with the council, but I'll also show the slide to you guys as well here in a little bit.
Great, thank you.
All right, so I wanted to show this because this is some of the background as to how we got kind of where we got with our GB mixed use current proposal. So this was back in February 7th, 2023, when we first talked with the council choosing options. So we had put before them, do you want to do one only? Do you want to do 1 and 2? Do you want to do 1, 2, and 3, which was the entire GB? And again, when we had this conversation with the council, this was before the GMA requirements actually had been fully vetted out on this planning for housing at the different income levels. In fact, most of the stuff on this got kind of more or less vetted out towards the end of 2023. So it's one of the reasons why everybody's been scrambling now on trying to figure out how they're going to be satisfying the various requirements on it. But when we had this conversation originally with the council, the GMA stuff was not part of that conversation at that time. So what they did select then is they did select 1 and 2 was the selection that they had made. So that was the original proposal we started with. And then when we took this back to the council in August, we actually added the CBD zones, in part because you've got a mixed-use zone being surrounded by a mixed-use zone, so we thought it made sense to have, to create the same zoning across the board. You don't have to, and you'll actually find here that council's direction now is not to do that, but that was the reason why we brought this forward originally, and we did this traffic analysis based on this, and this was kind of the breakdown of what we had come up with at the time based on information there, which I'm going to note that a lot of that information has been further, what's the word I want to use, has been further worked on and more details dived into and refined. That's the word I'm looking for. We've been further refining. So these original numbers we came up with, particularly in the housing, we kind of got these a little bit more solidified because that's a pretty good range, what we had put up there originally. And then based on all this, we had done a transportation analysis, which with the GB zone, both with it and without it in the neighborhood in this immediate vicinity. And what we found was, just share real quick, so in that analysis, we found that the intersection there where 175th intersects SR 202, so just over across the bridge here, that in 20 years is expected to fail unless we do certain improvements, come up with improvements and stuff. That intersection will fail whether this mixed-use zone happens or not. And then the other part that was the PM, and then we looked at the AM, and in the case of the AM, in the morning without the project, we don't have a failure, but with the project, there would be a failure. But the bigger issue here is the fact that whether it's AM or PM, the fact that that intersection will fail is one of the reasons why actually this is one of the things that's listed in our transportation plan as a project that we're going to have to address in the next 20 years. All right, so as I mentioned, the 16th, we had another conversation on the GB mixed use or on the East Rail mixed use zone. And what prompted that was basically there's been, folks have been contacting council members, and there's been these concerns being expressed about moving forward with the current proposal. So at that meeting, we talked about 6 alternatives to help frame the discussion. Now, again, I'm going to note that these alternatives were intended to send a baseline. We're going to talk about these in more detail today, and again, there's a lot of flexibility as to how we want to go about, and we'll talk about there are certain things that you want to take into consideration because we do need to be able to meet our GMA requirements, and there is things about spot zoning and stuff we got to be careful about, but you'll have some flexibility in where we end up as far as what we want to do about the boundaries and stuff on that. So this is, Commissioner Meza, your question about what happens with noncompliance. So as I mentioned, if this goes to if there's a challenge to our comp plan and it goes to the growth hearings boards, and ours would go to the Central Growth Hearings Board, they'll have a hearing, and there'll be a hearing, and there'll be a determination of either compliance or noncompliance that will be made regarding our comp plan. If the comp plan is found to be non-compliant, it is sent back to the jurisdiction with instructions on what you need to do to basically fix the problem. And so that's one of the things then you've got to work on in addressing those. And again, you can't wait till the next planning cycle. You've got to be doing this during this current planning cycle. You'll need to work on those and make fixes to that. There is the option, though, if there's a non-compliant, if they feel it's been, if there is a feeling that this has been deliberate, the hearings board can decide instead of that, they can decide, or if it's sent back to the jurisdiction, but the jurisdiction doesn't make any efforts to fix the problems, then they can send this order of non-compliance to the governor's office, and basically the governor does have the authority to essentially cut off a lot of tax revenues to the city. So being non-compliant, you're given a chance usually to fix it, but you've got to do it in that cycle, and if you still fail to do that, then the governor will have the ability to do sanctions, and it goes all the way from not being able to collect real estate excise tax to withholding motor vehicle sales and use taxes, liquor taxes, and others. And there's also could be a revising of the allotment and appropriations levels that come from the state in general. So the idea here is that noncompliance can hit a jurisdiction in the wallet pretty good. So that's one of the things to keep in mind as we try to work through these things. As long as there's a good faith effort being made, you're not going to see this happen, even if we turn out we're non-compliant, as long as we're making the effort. The main thing is if there is a thought that there's not a good faith effort being made, or it's being done very deliberately, then this is where this has a higher probability of getting sent to the governor's office. So it's important to be aware of that as we figure out what we need to do here. So does that help answer your question on that?
Yes, thank you. That answers what happens if we are not compliant. Can you briefly describe what it means to be non-compliant, or like what are the points that we have to hit to be compliant, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole list of things. It's basically the requirements of the Growth Management Act. So you've got all the stuff in RCW 3670A. There's a whole list of things that you have to satisfy. Most of the things were actually good because we were in compliant last time around, and a lot of those things haven't changed. Where things have changed has been in housing, is the number one area. There's been other changes too. There's going to be a requirement, for example, in the environmental stuff, in climate action. We don't have to necessarily be in compliance with that for this cycle because of how late everything came out, although we did a climate action plan, so we're planning to include that part of that in our updates right now. But that would be one of those things we actually would have more time on. But the housing probably is the number one thing. All the stuff around middle housing, around planning for housing at the different income levels, the accessory dwelling unit requirements, all of those things are things that are part of the GMA that are part of what we have to show compliance with this cycle. And I would note too, on some of the things like the middle housing, and I'm trying to remember if the ADUs were part of this. I think they are too. Both of those things, if there is a deadline for getting your development regulations in line with those pieces, regardless of everything else, and if you don't have those in compliance, like the middle housing requirements, for example, which is a different issue than this thing about income, the GB zone and stuff, they're actually completely separate issues. But like, for example, the middle housing piece of the puzzle, if we're not in compliant by, I think it's June 30th, 31st, whatever, of 2025, then there is a model ordinance that Commerce put together that automatically applies to your jurisdiction. So we want to make sure that when we do the middle housing, it's the way we want it to be done. We've got to be compliant, but we want to make sure it fits the way we want it to happen. So that's really important. But again, I'll note again, the middle housing piece of it is actually a separate issue from this planning for housing at all the different income levels. And I'll show a little bit more on a slide. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit.
And the compliance requirements for housing specifically, are there specific targets that we're supposed to meet? The reason why I'm asking is because we can rezone and plan as much as we want, but if developers don't build the type of housing that we're looking for, would that make us non-compliant?
No. If your zoning enables it, and the fact that it's not being developed. Now, there is a monitoring program, and we're going to get, I've got slides that will get into this a little bit more. There's a monitoring aspect that goes on, and in fact, one of the things with the county-wide planning policies is that we actually have to report annually on our housing. And then every 5 years, there's both the state and the county has a more in-depth, if you're not showing progress and things like that, then there's going to be a deep dive look into what's going on and stuff, and you may have to make changes at that point as well. But the way, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more, and I talked about it in the staff report. The main thing, the requirement that we have to do right now for GMA today is being able to enable housing that could potentially meet the requirements for us, because the big number is the low income, that meets those lower income. We just have to be able to enable it in our zoning. The markets will do what the markets do, but there's also these other provisions that we're not talking about tonight, but we will be talking about later, called adequate provisions, that do start getting into the details as to how you're going to try to enable this stuff to happen, because nobody is under the illusion, for example, because we have such a high number, that in 20 years we're going to see 1,813 units of low-income housing. Nobody has that illusion, but as long as our zoning is enabling it, that potential, then we're meeting our GMA requirements. And then there's the follow-up piece of it is what's actually happening, and that's where your adequate provisions come into play, and that's where the monitoring and all these other things are going to come into play. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And also just wanted to add some context to why I'm asking that specifically is if we do have specific requirements that we have to meet, then that kind of pushes us towards having mandates as opposed to incentives. So I wanted to just get an idea of like which one are we more inclined to use, I guess.
Yeah, so the targets themselves are mandates, but how you get there, you can use a variety of things. You can use mandates, you can use incentives as part of the way of getting there.
Yeah.
So there you have flexibility to look. And then, like I said, there'll be monitoring taking place, and that monitoring, we'll see how things are working. And based on what comes out of all of that, then down the road, there may be additional adjustments and things that happen. But I think when we get into that point, you know, I mentioned this, I think, to the council. When you get into this monitoring, I don't know whether that monitoring will be by jurisdiction, or whether that might be more like King County more broadly. That part I don't know at this point. Because, like, for example, if everybody's at least enabling it, but let's say, for example, most of the 80% AMI and below is happening, I'm going to make up a jurisdiction, let's say it's happening in Kent. Whether that then, if they're seeing plenty of it happen down there, whether then they think there needs to be further adjustments, I don't know. That's one of the things that I think is kind of unknown at this point. But that's part of the reason they're gathering that information, and then they'll use this information on housing and what's happening to determine what further tweaks, changes may need to be made in the future. The one thing that's recognized right now is the past practices aren't working, because there has been a declaration of a housing emergency in the Puget Sound and Washington State in general, although it's not throughout every county and stuff. And one of the things the legislature has basically saying is the past practices aren't working. That's why we're in this situation today. So this is why they're moving in the direction that they're moving, is because the past practices aren't working. So that's why they're forcing this stuff happening today.
Great. Thank you for the additional context. Appreciate it.
All right, so the next part is I'm going to get into that, although I've kind of already talked about some of this. I am going to start talking a little bit about the requirements on how we show that we're meeting the GMA requirements. So I already kind of talked about this. This was the House bill that required us to plan and accommodate for housing affordability at all the different income levels. And again, I'll just note here, it added a requirement to show sufficient capacity for housing that supports different income groups, including allowances for the transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, indoor emergency housing, and indoor emergency shelter. And as I noted on the second part of it, the bulletins about the transitional housing in that list, that was part of one of the things we did with updates to our development regulations back in 2021. This was the thing that we had to make sure we didn't have any barriers to the emergency housing. And then we also had to make sure we were enabling any zone where we allowed hotels, we had to allow for like emergency housing, and I can't remember all the other specific things on it. So we did those updates to our codes to make sure that we were consistent with those requirements. So that latter part, we believe we're in compliance with that latter part. It's the first bullet statement up there that we're primarily focused on at this point. All right, so I mentioned to you a little bit ago, so we've talked about GMA, but GMA is not the only thing we have compliance requirements. The King County countywide planning policies also have requirements. Most of them are reflective of the state, and I haven't had a chance to dig into this, but this checklist that they put in, and I think, Amanda, didn't you have a chance to look at the checklist a little bit? It's pretty extensive. But like I said, I haven't had a chance to look at all their particular requirements, but they've got there's requirements apparently in the countywide planning policies that are beyond what the state requires. And again, I think a lot of their stuff gets into the monitoring and potential for adjustments, but again, I haven't had a chance yet to look at all of this. But I wanted to show you the main policy pieces that are important. And the other thing that's important to note that came out of this whole thing is that every jurisdiction has a requirement to take their fair share of allocation. So that's when they did this allocation of housing by these different income levels, that played an important part on how they did the allocation out to the different jurisdictions. And this question came up in the council meeting about whether you could potentially like negotiate with others to maybe take more like the low income if we took more of the high income. And I'll mention to you what I remember, because I've been involved in planning for a long time, and I've been going to planning directors meetings for probably the better part of 16 years. And I remember like 10 years ago, South Sound communities complaining loudly how they felt like they were taking all of the low-income housing, and they felt that the northern cities should take more of a share of it. And I believe a lot of that's probably what shaped what happened with the countywide planning policies, in that they had this allocation across the board, because there was a feeling that a lot of the Sound cities felt like they were taking a larger share. And from my understanding, like, you know, we have an issue with the low income. I think Kent was an example. They don't have a problem with the low income. They have a problem with it. Was it the moderate or high income? They have a problem with the high income, because a lot of the housing they've had down there has fallen more into the moderate and the low income ranges. So every jurisdiction has different pieces that come into play with them, and the conditions are kind of dictating specifically what our fair share on how we have to kind of make up for what places we may have deficiencies in. Any questions on that before I go to the next slide? Okay. So you've seen this slide. I've shown this several times before. This actually shows the target numbers and shows how they're categorized into these broader groups. And this was also showing you household incomes that basically would fall into these groups. One thing I did make a modification to this slide, because in the past slide, as late as the council meeting, that bottom where it says the types of housing, and you see the types of housing that says low and mid-rise multifamily housing, low income group. Previously, under the moderate income group, you saw the townhouse, duplex, triplex, and accessory dwelling unit housing. Some of that could potentially have gone into the 50 to 80%. Diving into, because of us being in East King County, we actually have some different standards we have to meet. The townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and accessory dwelling units housing for us cannot count towards low income. And I'll show you the chart from Commerce here in a little bit. So I made an adjustment on this, basically for us to meet our requirements or show we're having our capacity, it has to enable low and mid-rise multifamily housing is the requirement. Okay, any questions on this slide? Because like I said, this gives you the breakdown. So we don't have to break it down by these individual categories you see here. We just basically, it's overall, these are all categorized as one broad number.
Mr. Meza has a question.
Thank you. The housing that's right here, is that considered low, mid-rise multifamily housing?
Yes.
Okay, and as far as I know, none of that type of development would meet these income requirements, correct?
You mean being able to count towards it today?
Yes.
Correct, no, it can't, because it's not currently, it's market rate, so you could count it towards the moderate income, because I think that's where a lot of that falls into, but you can't count it towards the low income group because that's not the market rates on them.
Yeah, and we do have existing incentives to create affordable housing. My statement is basically saying that the incentives haven't worked. To your earlier point of whatever we were doing clearly is not working, so we need to change something. So just wanted to point that out for the public and for the other planning commissioners. Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, we'll see here in a little bit, some of the other slides actually show what has been happening a little bit more. All right, let's see if there's anything else I wanted to note. I'll make this note too. So our original growth target numbers, you may recall, that were originally assigned to us was 2,033 housing units over this 2024, 2044 horizon. So originally when these numbers were created, Commerce actually did the original analysis on it, and then these were assigned down to the counties, and they did it by cities and stuff. I haven't seen exactly what the state had in the numbers for Woodinville, but I believe there were adjustments were made, because I think the numbers may have been actually even higher with the state, but they were adjusted down to fit our growth target number at 2,033. So when they did these adjustments, they had the totals still come out to the 2,033. The other thing I want to note too is, although we have these housing target numbers, this doesn't mean if you see the thing like for the moderate 62 and you see for the high income it's 158, because this came up a while back, this question came up. That doesn't mean that once you hit the 62 moderate income or the 158 high income houses being built that you can't allow any more housing in those brackets. It doesn't mean that at all. You can keep letting as many houses as people want to build into those brackets. That's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it doesn't count towards your targets. That's the main thing to know about that, is that this doesn't put a cap on how many can be built, but being in excess in these individual groups doesn't gain you any further advantages. So that's just something to note as well. All right, so I'm going to start diving a little bit more into the direction that Commerce, I do call this guidance, but it's basically how they're going to evaluate when you're showing your work. You have to show your work. This is the work that you are going to need to show in order to show that you're in compliance when you get into your numbers and stuff like that. So the first part I want to talk about is the land capacity, because that is the big piece. That's the big thing that generates this whole thing on the East Rail mixed use zone. So, and the way that Commerce talks about this is it's a capacity is a combination of available land, housing types, and densities. So what you're doing is when we talk about available land, we're looking at vacant lands, and we're looking at lands that qualify as what we call redevelopable. And there's a criteria we use, or criterion that we use for that, which is basically we look at the improvement value to land value. And typically when the improvement value is below the land value, it's an indicator that the property may be ripe for redevelopment. It's not a guarantee, but we have to use some kind of criterion to determine what properties may redevelop. And you're going to actually see when we get into some of the details, some of the properties that qualified for redevelopment are not likely to redevelop over the next 20-year planning cycle. So just want to mention those things, because that then plays into the next piece. As we're making assumptions, because there are assumptions that have to go into this stuff, we have to make what are considered realistic assumptions. So some of that's going to be based on what's been past market factors or things of what you've seen in the past with production. Some of it may be in looking into the future. You can look at some things, but then you're going to have additional provisions when you get to this adequate provisions piece. Whatever your assumptions are, you've got to have things that support those. So for example, if we wanted to make an assumption of affordable housing at 40% of all of our future housing was all going to be at the 80% AMI and below in that low income bracket, you can potentially make that assumption, but you're going to have to show under adequate provisions how that's actually going to be accomplished. And if you can't show that, then you can't use that assumption. So it's important to, as you're looking at these, when you come up with these assumptions, you can't just pull a number. You've got to actually have things that back it up. And that includes, like, if you're going to have mandatory requirements, if you're going to have, and I will also note, because if you had a mandatory requirement for 40%, 80% AMI, that's not realistic either, because nobody's going to build that. So you're creating a barrier that actually will serve as a barrier, and that probably won't make it through either. So you have to be realistic in the assumptions that you're making on this stuff.
So I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying on that. So if we were to say, in our plan, we're going to require everybody to build 40% affordable housing, the Commerce or whoever would probably come back to us and say, that's not a realistic number.
What they're going to do is look at your adequate provisions, and they're going to look at and have you explain how those adequate provisions actually will accomplish those numbers over the planning horizon. So you've got a little bit of some fudging. You can do a little bit with some of this stuff, but it still has to be somewhat realistic, and there has to be some good logic and something behind it. It just can't be made up. That's the main thing on it. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted. So now this is getting into the specifics. This is the table that comes from Commerce. That is kind of the key piece here, these two things. So the first one, the lower table that has the zone category, the typical housing types allowed, and then it has the lowest potential income levels served, and it says market rate with subsidies. So you'll see in here, this is where we categorize these housing units. And so you'll see, and then it also indicates where these typically occur. So in your low density, and honestly, this does match up Woodinville pretty well. Low density, what do you mostly see in low density? Single family detached. There isn't even if you have a mandatory requirement, for the most part, those houses aren't going to fall into those income levels. So you're not going to be able to count detached single family houses towards meeting your low income target numbers. Even if you put a mandatory requirement out there, because that housing type just hasn't been proven to serve to meet those requirements. And even if we did, even when you look at our housing, our capacity numbers, unless you're going to up the zoning in the residential zones, we can't get there with it anyway. So we use this, but we use this table then to assign housing types. And in terms of the low income, which is the extremely low, very low, and low income bracket, the 80 AMI and below, it's apartment and condos at the mid-rise, although this just says mid-rise, low-rise also qualifies, because they use low-rise later on. Low-rise and mid-rise apartments and condominiums, multifamily, all will basically qualify in this range. So that's when you have to start looking at your zones that enable this particular type of housing. And that's what the table up above is, where we typically see this. And I did mark up where you see the low rise and the mid rise and our high rise. So we don't have any high rise zones. In the mid rise, our CBD qualifies currently. And in the low rise, you've got the R12, the R18, the R24, and the R48. Housing production in those zones could potentially qualify. The big challenge is most of these low-rise zones that we have up in there don't actually have any land capacity left in them.
Commissioner Meza has a question.
What is PSH in the mid-rise level?
That is the permanent supportive housing.
Okay, thank you.
All right. One of the other things I want to note for you here as well is the bottom on that table with the zone categories and the typical housing types allowed with the lowest potential income level. ADUs, accessory dwelling units. This table, which applies to Woodinville and applies actually to Seattle and East King County and they use a different table for us because of the property values and stuff here. ADUs in the city here don't get to count towards our low income. They do get to count in some of the other jurisdictions that have less expensive property, but in East King County and in Seattle, ADU units, because the data that they collected on it showed that these tended to be more moderate income housing. They weren't going for the low income. So in our case, we can't count those. Now, I will note this because you'll see this when we get later on in the tables and stuff. Our ADUs and our middle housing, most of that will fall into the moderate income category. And so even though we don't necessarily need more moderate income to meet our target numbers, you will see that when we look at our housing production numbers, the middle housing and the ADUs are actually included in those numbers. Any questions on that?
So just to be clear, what this is saying is that for us to meet the income requirements, we need to build more mid-rise housing, or that's what we need to target.
Multifamily housing,
yes.
Right.
Multifamily, yep. Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So I did some number crunching about the slide about this, the housing goals, the income level goals, right? And I'm just curious, I mean, how are those goals being calculated? Is that being, mandated to us, or how do they share with us how they come up with the numbers?
I'm not sure I fully could understand.
No, what I'm
Are
saying
you
is-
asking about when the numbers came into effect, or?
A couple of slides back, you're talking about this housing targets for income levels, right? For example, for
This
30%. Yeah. So, for example, this is 1,303 units, right? For the 0 to 30% area median income. How did they come up with numbers? Is there a process they share with us, or just they put it out of the hat? Then
No, they didn't. They went into an in-depth analysis. I don't know all the particulars. You'll have to check with Commerce, but what they ended up looking at, they're looking at a whole variety of things. So they're looking at where people are, because they have lots of data on housing types. They also have data on household incomes of people. And so they're diving into what people are earning, right? What are households earning? What are being reported in households earning? And they're diving into different housing types, and they're determining based on what they consider a burden, what's considered a housing burden, which is when there's like more than 30%, even though people can spend more than that and still get through. But the general accepted number from feds all the way down into the state is that you're basically cost burden when more than 30% of your income is going towards housing, and that includes things like utilities, and I don't remember all the other specific things, but there's a list of things that are actually included into that whole piece. So they go through this whole entire analysis, and I'm not sure what all else goes into the soup on that, but there's a whole bunch of things that they do put into that in coming up with these numbers.
okay, I do have a follow-up question. Basically, say because I crunched some numbers, right? Say for this 0 to 30% area median income housing. It's 1,303 units, right? I mean, the total capacity we have currently is around 5647. So that's roughly 23% of all the housing capacity we have currently, right? So
Yes.
I want to ask a question. Say, does it mean that, is it tied to the, say, well, do we have 23% of the people, the residents in Woodinville living under the 30% income, or how is that?
So we did a housing needs analysis, and I don't remember the numbers. You'd have to go back into that and take a look, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Woodinville currently has only, let's say, 10% or 20% or whatever the cost burden is. We have to account for based on a regional basis, and so we have to enable housing for future, essentially for our population growth and stuff. We have to enable housing that can help make up for the shortages of housing elsewhere in the King County area as a whole. Because again, this allocation goes across the board for all the jurisdictions. So it doesn't matter what our current percentages are. What this is based on a broader analysis, and then everybody taking on their fair share.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's the part I still am not really quite clear about. I mean, how do they calculate the fair share, right? Basically, because say for this chart, what I'm seeing is that 23% of the current capacity has to be allocated for affordable housing with 30% or less area medium income housing, right? So I wonder what other cities are doing. Do they have 23% allocated to 30% or lower, or how that picture looks like for the other cities? I'm just curious because you're talking about a fair share, but I don't know. It's a very big word, right? So how do you quantify that fair share?
Well,
I think that's
they quantified it by these target numbers, and so the target numbers are what we're stuck with.
Right. I think what bothers me is that this particular process of allocating those quotas are not really transparent to the cities. I wish we can have more clarity on that.
Well, and again, if you want to contact Commerce on their details, or the Puget Sound, not Puget Sound, the King County Planning Council, because that's where all this in the countywide planning policies, they dive into that data a lot more detailed. But the numbers were originally assigned by the state in the state's analysis, and then these were assigned out by King County to the different jurisdictions. And those countywide planning policies were ratified by the majority of the jurisdictions in King County. So there was because King County has a ratification process. These numbers are included in that, and that's what makes these final, was that ratification process.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick follow-up. Based on that statement, are we to understand that the housing target numbers are specific to each jurisdiction?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, in fact, if you go in, you can look them up. They have the information available on the King County Planning Council's website. You can pull up the King County planning policies. I'll show this slide. This was this piece up in here. You see, this is from the cover, and you can see the last ratification. That last one in November, actually, I think had to deal with Sammamish. That wasn't these target numbers. I think it was one that was done, may have been done in August. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, that was the process. They went and adopted it. King County adopts it, then it's sent out for ratification, and there's a process that involves that. Everybody's notified about it. And ultimately, though, I will say this, that if Seattle and King County want something, they have, because the allocation on your voting, it's not like each city gets an equal vote. It's based on your populations as to what your percentage of your votes count towards the ratification. So Seattle and King County want something. It wouldn't matter if everybody else was actually against it because they would have enough votes. But in this case, I know that jurisdictions like the South cities, Bellevue, Redmond, Kirkland, they were in support of these numbers. So I don't know what jurisdictions may have actually voiced opposition to it, but it wasn't a lot of them. Most of the jurisdictions in King County voiced support for them. All right, let's see here. All right, before I go on to the next slide, any other questions on this one? By the way, really good questions, because again, this gets into, I dived into the technical stuff from what I got out of the guidance and stuff, but like I said, I wasn't going to dive into all the other details because there's a lot of stuff in there. And those are things, if you wanted to contact Commerce about, they can probably answer those things for you, or even potentially the staff over there with King County Planning Council could probably answer those questions a little bit more for you as well. All right, so the next piece of the puzzle, so let's see, go back here real quick. So you have the housing pieces. The next thing is then we start doing the analysis. I actually have a bigger breakdown in your staff report. I wasn't going to be able to fit that table up in here. In fact, that table originally out of the report we had, you couldn't have read it if I just copied and pasted it in, so I ended up converting it into something hopefully a little bit more readable. But anyway, I ended up just basically summarizing the breakdown of the different groupings. So primarily the single-family zones, we've got the most acreage in here, but none of those housing units there are going to count towards our low income. Those all go towards the high income. In the zones where we have multifamily, low and mid-rise, there's a total of 1.7 acres, and the net result actually out of those zones is 3 net unit capacity. So you see there's not a lot in those other multifamily residential zones. Where we have our big numbers is in the CBD. We did have some numbers in the TB, but most of that's been consumed by the Wood Mountain. So what's left is basically what you see there, about 3.8 acres. And again, when we do these assumptions about how much would be residential, we're assuming about 50% based on what the zoning enables of this 24 dwelling units per acre on it. So that's how we end up coming up with these numbers in terms of net unit capacity. So this is not talking about the middle housing. This is not talking about the ADUs. This is specifically about the net capacity based on the vacant and redevelopable properties, assigning density numbers to them. And in the case of the CBD, where we don't have a density number, we used the what we saw on average, which is like the Green Partners proposal, and what was proposed, what happened with Wooden Creek Village, which is the 63 dwelling units per acre. So we used recent development patterns in coming up with that density number.
For the EMU proposed district, would that fall under the 33.2 acres?
No, none of this is that one. We're going to get into that one. What I want to show you here is this is the first part of the analysis, because we get through, does our current zoning work? And that's the first question I want to answer for you. Even though we already know the answer on this, I want to show you why it doesn't work. And then we'll look at the alternatives on the East Rail mixed use piece of it.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Lang has a question before you move on.
Sure.
Robert, quick question about the CBD density. So I wondered a couple questions, right? So does it include, are we using current examples to come up with those numbers?
Yeah, I just mentioned Wooden Creek Village, and what was proposed with the Green Partners projects came out right around the 63 dwelling units per acre.
Oh, 63? Oh, do we have any other examples other than Wooden?
Well, we use them because those are like 40 acres, which is quite a bit bigger than everything else, and so that's the numbers that we used. So we've had some of the others like Woodgate. If you only take the front half of the project, it's around 105, but if you take the entire site, I don't know what it drops down to, because they're doing townhomes on the back side of it, and so that density drops down quite a bit. It may still be a little over the 63, but it's probably a little bit closer into that piece. So yeah, so we use those as kind of examples.
Okay, thank you.
Quick follow-up to this. So the 1968 unit capacity, that's what we have today, correct?
That's the capacity we analyze based on, this is the net acres, not the gross acres. So, if you go into that table, it's got a gross acre, and then you start applying deductions like for various things like market is potentially, critical areas is potentially, because again, like the CBD zone, and I'm going to show more details about this later, I think one of my last slides, that includes properties that we know aren't going to redevelop anytime for the foreseeable future, like the Target property, for example. So you have to, you make some assumptions on deductions based on that. You can't assume 100% because that's not going to happen. And then you apply those. And we did it based, there's a percentage, I don't remember what the CBD, we did 1% for the vacant, and we used another percentage for the redevelopable pieces, and then that's how we came up with the total. So if you look in the table, we actually have the details on how we broke that down in that table. That's in your staff report.
Okay, got it. So that is an assumption of both existing plus what could be redeveloped.
Vacant properties and potential redevelopment based on what I mentioned earlier about the improvement value to land value is the criterion we used on that
And
piece.
do we have a similar number for how many units would be affordable housing units?
So that's going to get into this next slide.
Okay, great, thank you.
That's the next slide. Okay, and again, right now I'm doing the existing zoning. So all this stuff is existing zoning right now. This isn't the East Rail. But I wanted to give you the background as to why the East Rail gives us what it gives us. All right, so as I mentioned, the next part here is calculating potential affordability. So this is where we're looking at those low and mid-rise, and then what we do is we have to make assumptions on how many of those, and if nothing else was to change. And so right now, you know, what we have currently happening in the CBD is about 4% of the housing units that have been either planned for or in the pipeline. About 4% of those are what we would call affordable. Now, I will note that not all of those houses actually technically are at the 80%. Some of them, I think, because some of the Green Partners may end up being at the 85%, but we're still counting all of those in the 80% affordability. So this is where we come up with basically that capacity, what we would anticipate if nothing else changed, where we would anticipate the 79 units. Now, I want to note, because we use the current market to do the initial evaluation, that doesn't mean we couldn't potentially make assumptions around, because remember I talked earlier about, you know, you could potentially decide that you're going to have a mandatory requirement, and we're going to look at those things too. So you could potentially increase that 79 number with an assumption of 10% or even potentially 20%. It's still not going to get you to the 1,813, but it can give you some additional flexibility as we think about the East Rail mixed use zone. And again, you'll see this when we get into some of the later slides on it. So before I go on to the next, any questions on this? Okay. All right. So this is showing the results, and this is showing the results using and make sure I'm thinking right on this. Yeah, this is showing the results with the 4%, using the 4% in the CBD. And so basically what you see is that this is the breakdown of what the units. This kind of goes back to you'll see the housing targets match up with the earlier slide. Now, this is where pipeline comes into play, because before we were just calculating land capacity, right? So we were looking at the properties that are vacant, and we were looking at the properties that could qualify as being redeveloped. But that's not the end of the story in doing this calculation, because since we started this analysis, when the stuff got applied to us, we've had a bunch of permits come in for a whole slew of other projects. We get to consider those also towards our targeted numbers. So in the pipeline, that's what you see where I have this, and these are the projects since 2019, that there certainly have been some adjustments potentially happening, but we're still using where things were at before the Green Partners thing happened, and where things were at before what we think is going to happen with a couple of other projects that we think are going to also collapse. But because there's development agreements, we can still currently use these as pipeline. So these are the numbers we ended up with. So you see under the pipeline, there is 146 units currently qualifying for the affordable. That's between the Green Partners and also what was being proposed with the Main Street over there at the Woodgate site. There was 146 units. So we get to count those towards our 1,813 units. And then the other ones fall into the other categories of the moderate and then the high income. And again, you can see where basically those pipelines will all qualify. And then you can see then what we have for remaining land capacity, so that then the last one shows you, when you take the target numbers, where are we at when you add all these numbers up? What's the surplus side of it? What's the deficit side of it? And in the case of the 0 to 80, the low income, we have a very large deficit of 1,588 units. You can see, though, under the other ones, we have very large surpluses for both the moderate and for the high-income housing. So before I get into the next slide, as we talk about some of these other pieces of the puzzle, any questions on this slide? Does this kind of make sense what I'm talking about?
Did you have a question, Commissioner Mason?
Yes. Did you say that the 146 units in the pipeline, that some of those may not come to fruition?
Well, 120 of those, I believe, was Green Partners. So depends on what happens with Green Partners and what happens in following up. But that was the number, that's currently the number that was under that development agreement that they were required to do.
Got it. So that number could potentially go down to 20-some units.
Or it could go up if Green Partners comes back in with a new project and there's new numbers out of it. So, I mean, it
So
could
we don't know.
potentially adjust.
Okay.
But again, even the Green Partners project's not going to get us, you know, even if you went up to a 20% happened on it, it still isn't going to be enough for this, the deficit.
Got it. I think a better assumption there would be to use that 4% that you had used earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that's the starting point. But like, and again, as we get talking into where we ultimately end up with these things, we can make adjustments to those assumptions. Again, if we can back up those assumptions, like a 10%, so like we're going to say, for example, we are going to have a mandatory requirement for affordable housing with all new projects, certain size and above, or even maybe just all projects, however that shapes out, then we can make assumptions of, we can increase our assumption of 4% based on plans to do something along those lines.
Got it. And just so that everybody's on the same page, the 120 units was for the Mulbacks project, which we don't know what's going to happen with that.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
But at least for right now, we get to count it with everything we're doing as it is right now. So, I mean, that's the reality, is that, you know, the problem you run into is things are always changing. And at some point, you just got to settle with what the numbers are. And even though things may change, it's still enough that gets us to where we need to go ultimately. And that's the main thing on it. But at some point, you do have to just kind of pick something and go forward with it, even though there could be potentially changes happening later on. That's where the monitoring, that's where the adjustments down the road then come into play later on.
Commissioner Krebs has a question.
Quick question. In terms of the different levels, extremely low, low, and low, could you build all, not all, but in theory, all one bedrooms to meet your quote unquote quota if you're just looking at units, or, you know, 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom?
Yeah, it doesn't get into the number of units. It doesn't get into whether they're studios or whether they're 1-bedroom or 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms. We don't have to get into that level of detail and determine. It just basically has to be multifamily, and it needs to be geared towards the mid and the low rise, enabling mid and low rise development. Doesn't mean you couldn't also enable high rise if you wanted to, but you have to be able to at least at a minimum enable mid and low rise for it to count.
Okay, thank you.
I do have a quick question on this. So I think one of the options on the table was to upzone CBD, right? So
we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you can see the big piece on this: current zoning, current approach, non-compliant. We can't meet the low income piece of it, so that means we got to do something. All right, and I kind of outlined, because Commerce in that guidance book talks about different ways. One of the things they talk about, if you're non-compliant, which we are currently, then one of the things to do is to look at potentially rezoning. And one of the things they talk about in looking at rezoning, also, they suggest you can take a look at, which is ultimately actually what kind of ended up being what we have with this East Rail mixed use, is if you've got underutilized like commercial properties. I mean, you can look at the residential properties and upzoning those. You can also look at upzoning other stuff. But they had these different suggestions, because if you still can't even get to those numbers, even with like with the upzoning of the current zones, they suggest that you do take a look at your underutilized commercial zones and potentially rezone to allow residential in there as one of the ways to get towards your numbers. And the interesting thing on that is at least for right now, you don't have to worry about the market factors on those. As long as you're enabling the mid and low-rise multifamily development in those zones, then the way Commerce's guidance works right now, because we don't have any of these other restrictions and stuff to worry about, because you don't do your analysis citywide necessarily, you do it on a zone-by-zone basis. So you're looking at the production in each of these individual zones. So in the case of a brand-new zone that doesn't exist, you don't have any market factors affecting it, so you don't really have to worry about that, at least as of meeting the GMA requirements today. Now, how this may play out down the road, that'll be a separate question, but we're talking about meeting the requirements today.
Quick question on the note here about avoiding spot zoning. Can you describe what spot zoning is?
Yeah, so as we get into those, and I actually put this into the staff report, so let me pull the staff report up, because it's easier if I speak per the staff report. And I will tell you, as I'm looking this up, it's not an absolute. There can be a lot of different factors that can actually go into whether something is a spot zone or not. But the key thing, there's one key ingredient in all cases, and that has to deal when if you're doing something that benefits an individual property owner that others cannot benefit from. Let's see if I can find it. Where did I say that? Yeah, okay, so I mentioned it in the staff report, it's on page 10, when we start talking about modifying and establishing new boundaries for the EMU. So to avoid spot zoning is when a rezone is made to benefit a single parcel by creating an allowed use for that parcel that is not allowed by for surrounding properties. And the reason, so that seems like that would be very straightforward, but the reason why I say there is some nuances to this. So for example, if that single parcel, let's use the downtown, our downtown here. If we had a 10-acre parcel in the downtown, single parcel, one owner, and we knew that we wanted this thing to accomplish whatever certain things, and we've been doing planning around it. There's been all this public effort and all this public outreach and stuff. If we were to rezone something like that large, and that has a benefit, a much broader benefit to the public as part of this rezoning, then it wouldn't necessarily be a spot zone. So generally, spot zone is when you're very specifically targeting a property owner for benefits, or even potentially maybe the opposite. But when you're targeting for specifically for benefits, that's where you have to be careful about this thing about it potentially being a spot zone. But it's not a clear-cut single parcel. It's automatically a spot zone. It doesn't work that way. There are some nuances in that.
An earlier public comment mentioned that MRM Capital owns most of the property in the East Rail district that we're looking at. Would that be considered spot zoning if we were to rezone that, since it's a single owner?
So they don't actually own most of the property in the current proposal. What they do is they own about maybe half the property over there along 131st and west of 131st. So including CBD and the GB zoning, they own probably about half, maybe a little bit more than that. Seawalla owns a big chunk of the other properties. Let me see if I can bring, nope. Oh, there we go. So this property right here, this has got a big warehouse on it. That's Seawalla. That's a big warehouse. Most of it's actually vacant right now. And then across the street here, I believe both these parcels, so these are some big chunks over here, both of those are still currently owned by Seawalla. I think MGM, is it MGM was the owner in there? I think they may have approached them about buying those, but I'm not really sure any of the details. So currently, a lot of this area, when you're talking about west of 131st, they own probably half, a little bit, maybe more than half, give or take a little bit, but that's both GB and CBD zoning. That is west of 131st.
Thank you for the clarification. Additional context. I believe the owner is MRM Capital, but they have expressed the desire to purchase the remaining land there, or at least the majority of that, so they can redevelop it in one big project. Is that something that we should take into consideration when talking about spot zoning, or not?
No, because this is lots of properties. Like remember where I again mentioned before, it's not necessarily a single owner. I mean, there's multiple parcels here, so I think, and they're large parcels. So I think you don't have to worry about a spot zoning here unless you decide to target out just a single parcel and decide that you're going to change, but nothing else is going to be changed around it. So like, I'm going to use the McClendon property because everybody I think knows where that is, and that's this property right here. So let's say you decided that only that was going to be EMU. Currently it's CBD zoning. And I know this isn't what's being planned, but I'm just using this as an example. Say you decide that that's the only property you want to make EMU and everything else is going to stay GB, or you're going to rezone the other things GB. That could potentially, but then on the other hand, because it is large enough, it may not be. This would be one, if you took an approach like that, I would caution, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically going to fall into a spot zone, particularly because when we do the zoning, we're not going to do it on an individual parcel basis. We'll do it area-wide, so we'll make a change. We'll be doing all this upzoning or rezoning or whatever the things, because you may recall me talking about this previously, where the railroad tracks is, that stretch there, for example, we're going to rezone that into parks. And there was also some other properties that we were going to rezone as well. So when we go to make those changes to the map, which will include all this stuff, we'll do actually what's called an area-wide rezone. So like I said, that'll help with things a little bit too. But I don't think anything, if you decided to do the rezoning west of 131st, I don't think any of that, even if it turned out MGM ended up buying all of that would necessarily qualify as a spot rezone because it's large, it's a lot of parcels. And I would also add this other little piece. I don't know if you guys remember this. I think it was 2 years ago. They came in asking for a rezone. They had a comp plan amendment to want to have this all upzoned to CBD at the time. And we asked them to hold off because all of this was going on. And so they did. That was one of the things. So they held off and they put that. And so they've been watching what's been going on in here. Now, just because they request a comp plan and a rezone doesn't mean that has to be granted to them. But I just wanted to note that their plans and their discussion about this actually goes back a couple of years. They didn't just start with all of this going on now. This actually all started before even this whole thing came up about the GMA requirements and even the discussions that happened with the economic development plan. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right, so this is now we're going to start getting into these different proposals. I'm going to start out, first of all, with the current proposal and a little bit about what the council talked about, and then I've got slides that actually will get into the more nitty-gritty on things. All right, so this first slide, this is the current proposal that we were talking about with council on April 16th, which is what they don't want to do any longer. But this was the numbers that came up when we did the analysis on this, based on the 63 dwelling units per acre is what we had used. We had no deduction factors west of 131st because this developer was talking to us about redeveloping the site. So we thought it was fair to say there was no deduction factors there. And then going east of it, because we know that the development in those areas has been really slow, we applied originally, when we did this analysis, we applied a 62%. You're going to see here, though, actually, based on some of the more recent things that have been talking about, we actually think we can actually increase, or I should say reduce that deduction factor down to 50%. But when we did this analysis, it was based on 100% west of 131st and a deduction factor of 62% going east. And these were the numbers then we ended up producing. This meets our GMA requirements. The other thing that was interesting that also kind of helped out about this is because we were converting CBD zone properties into these East Rail mixed-use properties, they went from only having the 4% applied to them to having 100% of the housing counting towards the target ranges when we did this. So, but like I said, the council, as part of their direction, does not want us to look at rezoning these properties and instead leave the CBDs as they are currently zoned. So again, that's kind of what they've asked for the Planning Commission to do. Ultimately, you guys will make your recommendation on what you feel is best, but that's some of the things we'll dive into a little bit more here as we talk about it. So anyway, so any questions about this original proposal?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the explanation. I appreciate it. So I do have a quick question on this assumption of 20% of, affordable housing for 0 to 80% income band, right? So how are we going to, I know this is actually based on past, history, this is a very strong assumption to assume that it might be 20% to have those housing units available for the development, right? So what are we going to do to ensure that this assumption actually will hold?
Well, the assumption is, again, so the GMA requirement, there's two different things going on you're talking about. There's the GMA requirement. The GMA requirement, if you've got the capacity, you're good. You don't need to get into all the other stuff on this. The other piece of this then is into those adequate provisions on how you're going to be able to enable it, which gets more expansive. And so that piece of it is a separate, it will be part of this whole, ultimately this discussion, but for the purposes of the GMA, you don't need to dive into that question at this point.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll talk about it when we get to adequate provisions, but you don't have to get into it in terms of the capacity analysis. The capacity analysis requires us to enable mid to low rise multifamily development. That's the requirement in order to show us meeting the GMA for the low income band.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any questions on this piece here? All right. So this is getting into more what the council had talked about, as I mentioned, pulling the CBD out. This is where our numbers end up. Now, I will say this because when we took this to the council, we actually indicated to them that this worked, that you would still be okay. But one of the things, and this happened between when I was putting the stuff together for council, I ended up having to dive pretty deep into the consultants' stuff. That's why this has taken me a long time, why we couldn't do this stuff last week, because I needed to dive into what the consultant put together, and there were difficulties with it. Because one of the things is, in order to make it work, there was this assumption of the CBD actually having 20%, having like a mandatory requirement of 20% of the CBD actually be coming in at the affordable range. So when you take that assumption out of it and you actually look strictly at the capacity analysis itself, taking the CBD out, actually, we end up not meeting the GMA requirements. And again, that happens because of what I mentioned before. You went from a 4%, or you went from a being able to count the entire amount in this, roughly it's about 5 acres, being able to count all of it, to basically being reduced down to only counting 4% of it. So has a huge impact by leaving it that way, but we have other options. We don't necessarily need to worry about rezoning this part of the city, the CBD, into the East Rail and still be able to make our requirements and stuff on it. So, and I showed you basically if we wanted to make these assumptions of 10%, then we would actually meet the 0 to 80, we'd have a surplus of 47 units. If we wanted to make an assumption of 20% in the CBD, then we would end up with a surplus of 244. I want to note, because I did find some errors in between what I put into the staff report and when I was putting the calculations together here. Again, just the risks of trying to get stuff out and put it together, because I think it's a higher number in the staff report, but it actually ends up being 244 units surplus, actually, when you apply the 20% to the CBD inventory. So when we get into talking about options and stuff, if you want to make a CBD assumption of 10% or 20%, you can make it work. You can make this work.
Commissioner Meza has a question.
Thank you. Assuming these numbers, whether we include the CBD or exclude the CBD, this would put most of the 80 to 80% affordable housing in the EMU, which I believe is essentially putting the majority of the affordable housing unit in Woodinville in that one district. Does that meet the inclusionary requirement that we had stated that we wanted to do?
So again, I'll go back to what I mentioned a moment ago. For the purposes of GMA, it's all about the housing type that you're enabling in order to show you're meeting the requirements. That's the requirement to meet the GMA. So the fact is that we would be enabling mid and high or low rise multifamily in the zone. Lets us meet the GMA requirement today. Are all those units going to actually end up being low income? No. we expect there's going to be a mixture of market and low income, so which is one of the reasons why when we talk about adequate provisions enabling, we'll talk more broadly about everything else. But for the GMA land capacity planning for at the different income levels, you have to enable this low and medium rise multifamily housing in order to get that to count towards the 0 to 80%. And one of the ways I kind of try to equate, I think this is what they were trying to do. So, for example, King County tried to meet some of its homelessness by buying hotels and putting homeless folks into those units. So they wouldn't have been able to have done that if there wasn't a hotel already there in the first place. So if a hotel had not been enabled in the first place, at one time that hotel was not for, homeless folks to live in, right? It was a hotel, people, temporary lodging and stuff like that. But because it existed, it was built, it existed, eventually it was able to be converted into something else. I think that, I can't tell you that as a fact, but I think it's kind of the same thinking. By enabling these multifamily, it at least enables the possibility in the future. For example, if the state ever does make money available for those lower income groups, it could be purchasing these buildings and converting them into rent control that will satisfy and help these folks at the lower end of the range. So that's why I said the requirement is to enable. And then we've got other pieces of the puzzle that'll come into this when we do talk about adequate provisions and stuff as well.
Yeah. My comment was mostly around the enabling part. So we're only enabling one specific area, which is the EMU area, and we're not enabling other districts or other zones, which feels very exclusionary. And inclusion was one of our goals, I believe, in our GMA. That was just my point. Thank you.
Right. So, that we did look. And in order to, so for example, if you want to upzone single-family zones, there is vacant property out there available. The R1 has a whole bunch of it. If you want to upzone that to multifamily, you can't upzone it and keep it at single-family and then count it. You would have to upzone it to multifamily zoning. You can. I think council in their discussions on that, though, didn't think that probably would go over very well with the community. So that's one of the reasons why the residential stuff was taken off the table and why the focus is in this area. Because you could, if you want to go look into other parts of the city and upzone to multifamily, it's possible, but whether there is support for that in the rest of the community, that's a different question.
And the rest of the CBD already has capacity, or would be counted towards the low income capacity, or no?
No, so the CBD, you can either do this 4% because of past trends. If we want to do 10 or 20% and then come up with other things that help support it, you could potentially go there. You could try higher than that, but you're starting to get into an area where I don't know how we would support it. So I would suggest 10 or 20%, but that would be of the future housing being built. And you're going to see this, and it was actually in your stuff there, you're going to have to enable something like an addition up to about almost 9,000 housing units to get your target numbers if it was just in the CBD alone. Now, like I said, if you want to look at a combination of being able to use a 10 or 20% in the CBD and combine that with maybe some other options in the East Rail, we can do that. There's some flexibility in how you might end up going about this. And we get into those slides, maybe that may show up a little bit better when we get there.
Thank you.
So, Robert, when you're saying 10 or 20%, you're saying we require either 10% of the units being built to be at an affordable, or 20% of ones. Is that what you're talking about, the 10 or 20%?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if I remember correctly, I'm going off memory right now, I think the housing capacity currently in the CBD with the 63 units per acre, I think is right around 1900 and I want to say 1986. I know I'm probably close. So that would round up to 1900, or excuse me, it would round up 10%, 190, 98, 199, whatever the number is. Actually, I've got something here that shows it later on. But anyway, and so if it's 10%, you would add that into the affordable numbers, or if you did 20%, then you would double that and you would add that into the affordable numbers. So again, the key is, though, if you're going to try to use your CBD, you would have to upzone it to the extent that you can get everything to the extent that you need it to be. So, and again, when we get to some of these other tables, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. I am going to note that this looks like this is going to go past 9 o'clock. I don't know if you want to do anything now or if you want to wait until we get closer to 9 o'clock.
Well, let's wait until we get closer to 9 o'clock, and we'll take a brief recess at 9 o'clock. And
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah, my voice can use it. All right. All right. So now, because now we're going to get into the evaluation. And what I tried to do here for you is, and I'm going to show you the slides here too, but this is also in your staff report. These parcels that are highlighted in red are the parcels that were identified as either vacant or qualifying for the redevelopment. And I broke this down by different sections, and I divided this up to kind of somewhat logical, and even within this there is some flexibility and stuff. So, and then we're going to pull these together, and we're going to look at those and see what the results are when we pull different pieces together on this. All right, so talked about the west of 131st. This is actually the breakdown. I mentioned to you before, there's no deductions, 63 dwelling units per acre. There's 14.6 acres of vacant redevelopable land. That calculates into 920 housing unit capacity when you're looking west of 131st. So that's area A. Make sense?
yeah, Commissioner Tricott, you had a question.
So I'm actually looking at page 32, and it's option E, but you're showing some things in white, some things in red, and some things in green. It's not clear to me what the white section is.
Which page are you on again, please?
I'm on page 32
Page.
of the packet. So it's option E, but it's under the consultant. It's an attachment 2.
Yeah, you're actually going to see that these correlate to what I'm showing up here on the screen.
Okay, I just want to clarify, because there are people in the room that own businesses in the white part of,
Yep.
of this.
Yes. That property there was, I'm going to show you that was not one of the ones identified as qualifying for redevelopment.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear for the business owners that are sitting in the audience.
Yeah. Again, but I'm going to mention this. I mean, again, this is our criteria we use for making these calculations, because we have to use something. What happens in reality could be something different, because even though we may not identify a property as being redeveloped, it could. On the other hand, a property we're currently identifying as redevelopable in the next 20 years may not.
Okay.
So that's, like I said, this is just the criteria we use for showing our compliance. The markets are ultimately going to dictate what ends up happening on most things.
Thank you.
And that standard we use, is that a standard that you use?
Yeah, using the land value to improvement value is pretty standard.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, like I said, that's what the calculations using these assumptions and things. This is what we end up with, is 920 housing unit capacity. I would mention, by the way, the MGM letter. You know, part of the reason they talk about those heights and stuff is because, and this is what probably talked about in general, both in the GB and in our CBD zone, you can't go underground with parking. So you end up pretty much putting everything above ground. And when you do that, then how do you make up for that amount of parking? Because as we've talked about in the past, parking's about $50,000 per unit when you do structured parking. That's also another thing, by the way, with the low rise, and even to a lesser extent the mid-rise, but particularly in the low rise, those usually don't have structured parking in them. They're usually going to have surface parking, which is a part of the things that also makes them a bit more affordable. Because when you start going into structured parking, buildings with structured parking at $50,000 a pop, you start really cutting into what you might see profit-wise on a project. They need more densities in order to, of course, that makes more parking requirements, but they need more density in order then to make the thing still pencil out for them. So, all right, so this is area A, west of 131st. All right, the next part here, I used 134th as a natural cutoff point. Let's see if I can get this thing to show up again. So this right over here, this is CBD zone over there to the farthest west, right along 131st. So we don't start GB zone until we get to these properties. You can see, and I chose to pull the aerials down from King County, because that way you can actually see, as of 2023, what are on these properties, and you can kind of get a feel for what is out there right now, what's under the red. Those were the ones we identified as redevelopable. The property you see up here, this, even though this is vacant, this is WASDOT property. So it's set aside. There's no development that's ever going to happen on it. WASDOT owns that. I think they use it for stormwater and stuff. So that's why this didn't get included in it, because it's not available for development. But anyway, so the breakdown on this, which is Area B, again, continuing to use this, but this time we use a 50% because you have Little Bear Creek going through there, and you've got buffers, and again, whether these properties will actually redevelop. We use the 50% deduction factor, and the number of units, I think, is that right? No, that's not right. It's not 920. I made a mistake up there on the aerial. I think it's in the staff report. What's that? Okay, yeah, and I know I have in the later stuff, when I show the breakdown, I got a table that puts all this together, it's correct. Anyway, yeah, so the 920 is not a correct number, it's a lot less than that. Thank you for that. Like I said, again, putting this stuff together just before the meeting ended. All right, then we get up, you'll notice again, as Commissioner Turcotte noted before, you've got this property here was not identified as redevelopment, but these other ones up in here, and you can again see kind of what's on there. This is 9.4 acres. Again, same 50%, 63, ends up being 355 housing units in this piece of in this area. And this actually took us to the northern part of the original GB mixed-use zone proposal. So the next one, because this is the other letter you got, the folks that have the Innovation Center site that have talked about right now, they're indicating, and by the way, they were indicating this to me. I actually got contacted about this before they came out with this letter, actually a little while back, as they've been working on their permitting. But you can see this property is almost all vacant. Now, the northernmost piece of property, this one up here, this is not part of the Innovation Center. This is owned by a different property owner, but this was also identified on a land value to improvement thing. It was identified as actually potentially qualifying to be redevelopable. So when you take all of this together, and again, I had a map boundary error in the staff report. I forgot that northern boundary, but the statistics and stuff are correct. It's 11.8 acres, 63, soon 50%, and ended up, we calculated roughly about 446 housing units could be capable on this. And I think in the staff report, I even broke it down. If you decided that you didn't want to include the northern piece, I don't do this in the later stuff, but in there, I think there was like 100 and some units on this. So, I mean, you can potentially even break things down even further when we kind of try to figure out what we're going to settle on with the boundaries and stuff. And then the last part is this going north of this, and there's only a couple of properties vacant. This property right here, this is where the hotel, the Hampton Inn, is located. So this is that vacant property behind them. And then up here on the corner, this also got identified. You could technically extend this because if you go north of this, it's still GB, and you could technically, because a lot of it is vacant, it was identified. But that's the Floor and Decor site, and they actually have indicated to it, they're basically got their permits ready to almost go. I think there's a couple of small things, but they're expecting to do construction starting this summer. So even if we included it in the mixed use zone, you could, but it's not really going to be available for counting because it's being rebuilt. It's being redeveloped this summer. So this last piece here is 2.6 acres, 63 dwelling units per acre, 98 housing unit capacity is where we end up on that. All right, so that's the breakdown. So then what I do...
Robert?
Yeah.
So, I don't know if this is working now. So at the bottom outside that yellow, that's the northern piece of the slide before, and then...
Yes.
Okay. Just trying to get my bearings. Thank you.
All right, so now I'm going to take these and I'm going to put these into tables. And here I break this down. Now, you'll note here on the C actually had this in here, but for the purposes, again, kind of following some of what council talked about, this is where a lot of the concerns, there may be some other properties as well, but this was that one that's still purple there between B and C is where a lot of the concerns were about potentially being included. Haven't talked to the property owner yet, but obviously the tenants had brought concerns up to the council and brought some concerns up to you tonight. But anyway, so this is just showing you so you can correlate A, B, and in C, I just shrunk it down to the redevelopable portions of it, D and E, and then I break it down into these options. And again, that doesn't mean these are the only ones. There are other ways we could potentially look at this as well. But what I did here then is you can see, I think in the packet I call them like A, B, and C options, but because I did area A, B, and C over here, I decided to call them options 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I want to note for you, option 3 and 5 are the two that would comply kind of with what council was talking about giving directions on, and also in being very safe from the spot zoning. Although, like I said, you could potentially include C if you wanted to and exclude just those 3 parcels. May not necessarily be a spot zone, but in looking, if you want very clear direction on it, if you want to take that parcel out where the tenants have come in and you want to avoid for sure a spot zoning claim, then you would probably remove parcel B out of it as well. And you can see then how these break down. So option 1 already indicated, that's the current proposal without the CBD. That doesn't comply. If you do option 2, which is where we grab, and I just break it down and show you the numbers on each of the housings, the 920, the 242, the 355, the 446. And then I also added in this current 79 for the CBD. That's based on that 4%. And then the pipeline, which has 146, and then that shows you then how our numbers pan out. So option 2, we would meet the requirements, but it does potentially or not include that property that had the tenants here talking to us, or actually it's 3 properties actually, but it's one big development. Option 3, we would meet the requirements. That takes out the area B, and we would exclude that other particular property as well with it, but that can meet the requirements. Option 4, which is where we're looking at A, D, and E, so we're going further north with everything. We're still keeping A in it, but everything else then is further north. That ends up actually having a deficiency on it. But again, if you want to you'll see in a moment when we get into the next, if you play around with the CBD stuff, you might be able to still make that work. And then option 5 basically has everything but B, including that other parcel piece there a little bit. And that number also works as well. So before we go into the next example where we're going to actually look at doing a 10% applied to the CBD, questions on this? Does this make sense what I did?
But this might be a good time to extend the meeting. How much longer would you like?
How long do you think you're going to want to talk about these options?
Oh, at least 2 hours? I don't know. What does everybody think? Another half hour or be good? Okay. Can we have a motion to extend the meeting to 9:30?
Motion to extend the meeting until 9:30 p.m.
Second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Turcotte and a second by Commissioner Meza to extend the meeting till 9:30. Any further discussion? All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Okay. Let's just take a short, brief, 5-minute break. Is that good?
So start back up at 9?
Pardon?
Start back up at 9 o'clock?
Sure. All right. We're in recess.
I have been. My voice is starting to hit its limit.
Do you like some tea or something?
I think it'll be okay. We're actually getting near the end of it.
Thank goodness.
It is. I'm hoping though this helps.
All right, the Planning Commission is back in session for Wednesday, May 1st, 2024, and we'll continue now with the staff report.
Okay, so as I mentioned, again, I'll just real quick again on this. So I took those options, you see that over in the map, and then I broke down the housing. Again, you can see I got it correct on this one. And then you can see the totals and where everything ends up on these different combinations of stuff. So that's with the CBD 4%, 79 units counting. Now, if we go and do a 10%, this is how the numbers change. So you can see we actually, with 10%, the option one works, but that has that over there B and C on both sides of the one property, but it would work. It also can work under option two, which adds the property there to the north. And you can see on option four, which is basically, that was area A, area D, and area E. So it's most of the north and then the stuff over to the west, the 131st. While that is a little bit short still, I mean, there's maybe some possibilities to tweak a little bit, or if you decided to go up to the 20%, because you can imagine if the 20% just double this 197 and add that on here, and you can see how much more the surplus works. So again, you've got some things you can kind of play around within this and choosing what areas to include, and also whether you want to stick with the market on the CBD or whether we think we may want to make an assumption of 10 or 20%. And then if we do that, like I said, we are going to need to do the assumptions, the adequate provision pieces to make sure we support whatever it is that we're doing on that. So before I go to the next one, which is the CBD zoning, and then we'll come back to this and we can talk about these alternatives. Any questions on this slide, on what I did here? Okay. So the last part I do want to talk about, because this has been brought up about the CBD zone, about upzoning, and the council did talk about it. And so this is kind of the breakdown. This is the properties that would qualify. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there's several properties you can take right out of this equation. One of those is like, for example, the water district utility property. I mean, it clearly looks vacant, but that's not going to have housing on it. They use that. They've got a siphon facility. They're not building housing or anything on that. So that's a property that would come out right off the bat. I'm trying to think. You've got some other properties like the Target and the movie theater. You can leave them in there for the purposes of this analysis. Whether they actually will redevelop, that's questionable, but you could be able to leave those in there just for the sake of this analysis. What else did I want to note? Oh, and I also want to note that a lot of the properties, by the way, that are identified as being redevelopable or vacant are actually along 131st. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're looking at the CBD upzone and not changing the zoning on that, is that those are actually a lot of the properties where if we were looking to try to just upzone the CBD, those are the areas you're going to have to be enabling these taller buildings and stuff like that. So in all this going together, basically, if you were to upzone this enough so that you could do like the assumption of 20%, you would need 8,335 new housing units. I think the consultant's report said 270. I think this is what we told council. But like I said, there was some incorrect information. When I recalculated it out, it's actually 251 dwelling units per acre. And if you want an idea how to compare that, the project over here with the Woodgate, just the mixed-use building, forget the back half of the property, just the front half of the mixed-use building, that's right around 105, 110 units per acre. So basically, in order to make this work, you would have to go into allowing high-rises, and you would need to also reduce parking requirements because otherwise you're not going to have room. And the other thing is that we may have to look at our design standards too, because our design standards have certain requirements for open space and all this other stuff, and those also do gobble up. Parking gobbles up some of the capacity, and requirements for plazas and open space and things like that also gobble up. And so the feasibility of that, we'd have to take a look at our commercial design standards. So all that combined, council, we've had these conversations in the past about increasing height in the CBD zone. And while we did increase it in the east frame, you'd have to look to increase it not just in the east frame, you'd need to look to increase it in the pet core, and you'd need to look to increase it also, like I mentioned, in the east, in the civic center, right? Gateway, which is the area along 131st, yeah, in those design districts as well, in order to be able to have the vacant properties and to get your densities and stuff enough that you would need to get. I would note there is also one big piece there that's actually part of the Green Partners. That got included because the Green Partners in their proposals for housing and stuff, they actually didn't have anything. That was their last phase. That's this property right here, this big piece right here. They really didn't have anything. I think that was really loosey-goosey. So that's one of the reasons we were including that, because even though it was included in the development agreement, that was actually still open to what might end up happening on it. So that's actually one of the biggest chunks of property. You're also looking at the cut shop, and then you're looking at some of those properties over there in the Old Town, although a lot of those are a lot smaller. So this was major reason why the majority of the council did not necessarily support thinking that the upzone, because it may not necessarily be able to be defended. But having said that, again, if you want to make some assumptions about potentially having more mandatory requirements in the CBD zone, you could potentially include those into help satisfying and making adjustments on the East Rail mixed use zone. So those are all of the slides. And before I go back then to the East Rail, the final things I want to mention, a couple of things, and one of the reasons why we needed the special meeting. So council had talked about modifications about the GB mixed use area being considered, but the important things to keep in mind is that we have a deadline of December 31st, that's the end of this year, to be updating not only our comp plan, but our development regulations. There is a little bit of fudging on that. As long as we get things done by June of 2025, we're not going to have those other things kicking in. And as long as we're making a good effort, the state and county, nobody's going to be coming down on us as long as we're making efforts to move forward on things. But I also wanted to note this, that we have to submit our housing chapter to King County Planning Council. They said right now the review time on that's about 2 to 4 months. And I already mentioned the thing on the wiggle room. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that we do have some deadlines that we are working on, that we do have to take into consideration. So with that, I'm going to go back to this slide and kind of just get your take, if there's any thoughts about what kind of configurations you want to have us focus on. And then the thing I will note, I mean, this is how we will move forward in our analysis and stuff. That doesn't mean this is the final decision, because if, as more information comes in, do you want to make further modifications to this, we can, but I just need to have an idea how to move forward with our housing chapter, and so that's why I need your feedback, right? I'm asking for tonight, so I know how to move forward on that. So with that, I can close my mouth for a little bit.
Yeah, I have a question, just in general about the options that we have considered. So far we have only discussed the new zone, which we're calling the EMU. Have we considered creating other similar zones, either throughout the CBD or elsewhere? So instead of the entire CBD being upzoned, break it up into smaller chunks that we can upzone.
Well, again, what I mentioned before, you're not going to be able to pick chunks that are already developed that don't qualify as either vacant. So you're going to be going back to this map in that consideration. And you're going to have to allow high rises and everything else. So again, this is what you're going to have to take a look at in order to make sure, and you're going to have to be able to get these housing units at those levels if you were going to be looking at the CBD zone. So given that we've got a lot of these properties are spread throughout the CBD, I'm not sure you could alone just pick certain spots and make it work. But like I said, if you wanted to do some of this in conjunction with, some of this, what's going on with the proposal with the East Rail, you could make some things work that way potentially.
Yeah, my thinking was not necessarily to replace the EMU with another district, but to do it in conjunction so that we're not enabling all of the affordable housing capacity in one specific area, but that we spread it around. That was the thinking, at least.
Okay. Did you have a specific area in mind you were thinking of, or?
I didn't have a specific area in mind. I was wondering if we had considered that as part of the study that we did.
Well, again, we looked at upzoning the entire CBD. So in council's discussion, this is one of the reasons I brought this up. Council's direction was to keep it focused more in the GB area. But the reason I brought this up is because if you want to think about a combination of the two, you can do that. And I wanted to make sure you had the ability to have that conversation. And then council, if they agree with that, then they're in a position to incorporate it. Or if they decide that they want to go back to the more narrow focus of the GB, current GB area, then they could do that as well.
Yeah, I would definitely be open to considering those options. And I've heard some comments about taking a little bit more time to evaluate both the options presented here and other options that we haven't considered yet. So just putting that out there. Thank you.
Anybody else? Commissioner Turcotte.
In considering Area E, since it does have floor and decor, do we know the approximate housing units, or is it 98 for the property adjacent to the Hampton?
The Area E includes the area to Hampton, and then there's another parcel. It's this other parcel right here.
Yes, so floor and decor.
No, this is the Hampton, and then this property right here. No, this isn't floor and decor. Floor and decor is over here. It's north.
Oh, okay. So
Sunbelt Rentals, that last piece there.
Yeah, floor and decor is on the north side
okay,
of 195th.
thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Martin.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I definitely lean towards option 3, which I think was option D in our packet. It includes A, C, D, and I also really lean towards the 10% in the CBD zone. I think any future development in CBD should have a requirement of 10% affordable housing. I think that can help spread us out across the city a little bit more for affordability. But definitely I don't lean towards including B in the EMU, since it had established businesses that we want to protect. And C and D, those areas are near Park, they're walkable to Target. That seems like a great area we could have housing, especially along the trail. And our Zone A, I've walked actually 2 businesses in Area A. And so having housing there seems like a great opportunity for walkability along the trail. So that's what I lean towards. So love to hear what you guys also lean towards.
Thank you. Commissioner Lang.
Yes. I have a clarifying question. So on the slides, I think it is options 1 through 5, right? And in the staff report, the attachment number 2 uses A, B, and C, D, E. And what I'm struggling is I can't really find the say this option say, well, you have surplus 330. I don't know which one is on the slide, because the slide has the one has a 375, but it doesn't have one with a.
Can you speak in the microphone?
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, I couldn't really have a good one-on-one mapping between what the options we have in the packet and what is presented in the slides.
They correlate.
Can you
with
clarify?
each other. They correlate to each other. I mean, even though, like I mentioned before, I used a different number because I had the area A, B, C, D, but they correlate with each other. So these are options. And again, you can also make modifications to these options too, if you wanted to. But all the analysis that's in your staff report on far as summaries, it's all presented up in here as well, and showing the variations over here I just broke it down even a little bit further to put this map to the left together so that you could help correlate those areas specifically to the table a little bit easier.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. I don't have an opinion at this time. I'm going to need a little more time to digest it and I would love to, is your staff report available online, or will it be? Because I'd love to go back.
Yeah, it was released with the Planning Commission
Okay.
packet. One of the things that might be useful, because like I said, I found a few more pieces and stuff as I went and put this together. I could put some summaries of this stuff together a little bit more to simplify it that way and then send that out, because, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the staff report, and I try to give you more of the background, how we got up to where we got up to. But ultimately, this is where we got to actually figure out, this is actually where the rubber is going to meet the road on this, and figuring out a selection along these, including with the CBD. So if it's helpful, because I can understand there's a lot of stuff I just gave you tonight. If it's helpful, I can try to put some things together using this slides and stuff that maybe help summarize. And then I do need to get some kind of direction. And so maybe the meeting here in May, we can ultimately settle on where everybody wants to, at least at this time. Again, doesn't mean you can't change your mind later on when we get towards the end of this, but at least where we're starting out at.
That sounds reasonable. Does everybody concur with that then?
Are you looking for us to narrow it down at this point, so you know what to focus on?
Well, it would be great, but it sounds like I think what I'm hearing is that I think most of you might want to think about this a little bit more, because there is a lot you're digesting tonight. I've spent the last 4 or 5 days continuously working on this, so I've got a lot of it already in my head. You guys are just kind of hearing it for the first time tonight.
So I agree with taking more time, but if you're looking for some sort of direction, I also agree with Commissioner Martin that options 3 and 5 are my preferred ones. In addition, I would like to see some options that include additional, for lack of a better word, additional emus in the rest of the CBD. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I need to get better direction and make sure that that's actually what the commission as a whole, because if the commission as a whole doesn't want to explore that, our resources are kind of limited on what I can do. But if you guys as a whole want to explore some of those, I just need to get some idea about what it is you would want me to look at.
If I could just finish my comment. The reasons why I would like to see additional zones created is, if you can see here, that entire strip is right next to the highway. It's not the most desirable area. So I would like to spread the affordable housing in different areas so that, at least from an optics perspective, it does not look like we're putting all of our affordable housing in the least desirable parts of Woodinville.
Yeah, I would note that for the planning purposes, think of this not as affordable versus non-affordable for the planning purposes, because it's the low and high-rise multifamily is what you want to think about, which will be making up of both market and market rent controlled. And I would also note, with the investment that we're going to be putting into the East Rail, that should also do a lot to help transform a lot of that area too, because there's a lot of money being thought about being put into that area, up and down along what's currently the rail lines and stuff. So I mean, that area potentially is going to transform with redevelopment going on.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing here with the development of the trail, that really makes that attractive for some redevelopment into housing. And that, Commissioner Martin.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to also say, do we have any ways that we could require, as we put in housing along the highway, sort of sound barriers or additional planting of trees, something to provide a barrier between residents and the highway? I know we had a public comment about how growing up or living near highways expose you to pollution. And so that is something I want to be mindful of as we add housing into this area. Is there some requirements we could do there?
Well, so there's a variety of things that go into that. Among other things, when you build buildings, there are certain requirements with ventilation and all that kind of stuff. So those play into it. We also do have Little Bear Creek that actually serves as a barrier, at least through parts of it. But we also, I think in our development regulations, we also do have like increased setbacks, I think, along 522. Is that where those are at? And so we do have some other things along those lines, and we couldn't even look, if there's a desire to put even more in place, those are things that also can be considered when we're putting the development regulations together. I mean, one of the good things is, like I said, for a lot of these properties, you know, Little Bear Creek runs along the, essentially, near 522. So their development's going to be closer to the Little Bear Creek Road. It's going to be closer to, you know, to the east, not to the west, because there's already natural barriers because of the creek and the shoreline jurisdiction, or not the shoreline jurisdiction itself per se, but the stream buffer, which is 100 feet, that is going to also be creating barriers and stuff in that area as well. So we do have some other things there, but that Little Bear Creek, I don't think runs the entire duration of this. I don't believe, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. So, I mean, if we want to put additional things in there, particularly as you get further north, I don't think Little Bear Creek runs up there further north. You know, we can take a look at those development standards when we get to that point, look at whether the 20, I think it's 25 feet is sufficient, or whether even more might need to be considered on that. But that would only be like if you're looking at E. I think if you're looking, your recommendation with A, C, and D, and I think Little Bear Creek probably covers a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it goes under
Yeah.
the freeway right around where that D and E line is, somewhere right in there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I looked at the other map, and yeah, I did see the creek, so that's nice.
Yeah, so that'll help create some barriers on it too.
I think Little Bear
cool.
Creek, it goes under 131st, doesn't it?
Yes, it does
Yeah.
do that as well.
So I don't know where it goes after that. It's obviously been buried under,
Are you talking about like in area A where it goes?
yeah.
It kind of runs, it is, I think, piped through there, but it runs kind of through a parking lot and then under the trail to the
So
finish.
with redevelopment, that would be daylighted then, probably.
We can sure shoot for it. That's
Yeah.
would be great. Yeah.
That's a good point. All right. So anything else? All right. You got anything else, Robert?
Yeah, I just want to get some clarification. To what do you want me to take a look at these little mini areas in the CBD zone? And if there is, what would be some of the things you would want us to focus around looking at? So like, for example, would you want us looking at 131st still? Because I think that's one of the areas we don't want to do based on the fact that we don't want to do CBD, but do you want us to look, would you want us looking over there with the Target or, I think Doug's Boat area, that's always been a prime area for redevelopment. We hear people all the time wanting to look to buy that to redevelop.
Yeah, I can't say because I'm not really sure where you'd want to, I mean, I'm not real clear what you're thinking, to be perfectly honest,
Yeah.
so I can't say yay or nay.
So my suggestion would be, yes, to look at additional areas, and the primary areas that I would focus on are the ones that are closer to the PED zones, so closer to the downtown, I guess.
Well, that would be here with Doug's Boats. Right
Yeah,
here.
those areas.
Although this here, right here, where 140th and 175th come together is a natural area. I mean, this is, but of course, like I said, this is the theater right here, and then this is Target up here. So I don't know to what extent that actually is even practical, although I think this has been torn down. I think that's why that's vacant. I'm not positive, but I think that's been.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, theaters, I don't know how viable they will be going forward, so it could be a prime area for redevelopment.
Yeah, I do know that, TRF, right? I get their name. I'm always worried I get the name. TRF has talked to us about potentially redeveloping the parking lots.
Mm-hmm.
They don't show up on this because of the other development, but they've talked about potentially being able to redo the parking lot areas in there. But those are 30-year plans, not 20-year, because they have leases and stuff that actually create barriers for them right now.
Well, those would be my suggestions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I mean, you could look at those as micro, it's just it won't help us in this calculation because they don't qualify right now for the vacant or redevelopable. But it doesn't mean you couldn't potentially look to rezone some of those still.
So I'm not seeing any other commissioners that want staff to take a look at that at this time, so.
Okay.
Yes,
What I
ma'am.
will do, though, for you, George, I'll take a look at a couple of little pieces, and I can just share that with you. And if anybody else wants to share, we can. I'll share, not as part of the meeting, but we'll just do it informally.
All right, that takes us to our second public comment period. Has anybody signed up? Nobody signed up. Anybody in the audience care to make public comment? Seeing nobody, we are adjourned.